Hey, Roman, and I'm in Paykus Publishing, working as a business developer manager, and hit games are and I'm honored to present the first speaker, Mariusz Gąsiewski, who will be presenting his speech. Just in few seconds, we have still connecting. The topic of his speech will be the mobile gaming market in 2024, what we can expect based on the data. So I'm glad to add to the stage Mariusz. Hello, Mariusz.
Hello, nice to be here.
Yeah, it's nice to have you. So we'll not take more of your time. You can start. Thank you.
Okay, great. So it's really the pleasure to be here. So let me actually uh, mm, connect my presentation. Can you see my presentation? Roman, can you see it?
Yes. Right now it's
Okay,
visible.
great. Okay, so today we'll be talking about mobile gaming market in 2024. It's actually quite interesting topic. We don't have a lot of time, for going into the data, but still, I would like to look at three specific elements. What is general view on the gaming market? Uh, what can we see once we go a little bit deeper, and where are actually the mobile gaming opportunities for the 2024? So if we start from the beginning, we see that in general, Android and Apple are like the biggest stores. So if we look at the latest data for 2023, Android is including the Android stores in China, and is estimated to have more than 2 billions of users, which is quite significant growth from 2020. Apple has around 700 million users. And if we compare it with other stores, which are more between like 250 to 350 users, is still majority of the gaming market. If we look at what we can expect based on the newest data for the next years, still the mobile is supposed to be growing with the highest pace, but of course with much lower numbers than in the past. Because even if we look at the year-over-year growth of mobile users, so how many players we have if we compare it with the previous year, mobile is the highest. It's expected to grow around 5% in 2024 versus 2023, but it's still, of course, a lower number that we had, for example, like 2020, when it was almost two-digit number. But still, overall, is the highest growth. Of course, especially in mobile, most of that growth is coming from emerging markets. Even if we look at those four markets, which of course are the biggest in terms of the scale, we see that that growth of users in US is not high anymore. It's like almost flat. But at the same time, if we look at markets like Indonesia, India, or China, that growth is still significant. For example, if we look at India in 2024, that growth, that number of mobile users estimated to be around almost 400 millions, compared with a little bit more than 300 millions in 2020. If we go deeper and we look at smaller markets, just looking just at the mobile part, we see that, for example, if we compare 3 years, so what was the year-over-year growth? So, for example, 2020 comparing the growth of players versus 2019, or in 2023 comparing with 2022, or expected in 2020 compared with 2025, we see that in general that growth is still nice, but of course decreasing. So in all markets we see that growth of mobile users is still existing, although with decreasing growth rate. Yes, so in most of the markets around 2025, 2026, that growth is expected to be just around like 2 to 4% year over year. Around this year, if we compare 2024, 2023, or 2023 to 2022, that growth is expected to be around like 4 to 5 countries, of course, with much higher growth in countries like Turkey, Philippines, Brazil, versus markets like France, UK, or Japan, where especially we see that in tier 1 markets in Asia, that growth of mobile users almost flat. If we go deeper in terms of the data for the last months, we can see that in general, the data looking at the gaming overall is improving. So that's the latest data based on the data AI, looking in January 2024 versus January 2023. On general level, on Android, the revenue growth was estimated to be around 6% year over year. So quite nice positive growth in terms of revenue, even if we look at the last 6 months, especially if you compare what was happening in 2022 or like beginning of 2023, where actually most of that growth was even negative. In last month, there is some growth where we see actually that in general the revenue is growing faster than downloads, which of course is coming in a few aspects. Like on one side we see much more focus on the user acquisition coming from high value users. We see more and more focus on live operations and all different techniques to really retain user and keep him as long as possible with the game, rather than just focus only on acquisition of users. That's why actually we see better and better monetization, especially of top games. So that's finally the revenue was faster than downloads. If we look at the iOS, at general level, that growth rates are a little bit lower. So for example, in general, if we look at the last months, in iOS, we see that this revenue growth rate is negative. It's between -5 to minus even 10%, but mostly coming from very interesting point that in general, even if we look at the last 12 months, including the January 2024, of course, in the whole mobile gaming revenue, we can actually divide into the Android revenue, which is around 41%, then iOS revenue that is excluding China, which is around 45-46%, and then iOS revenue in China, which is around 13%. And of course, for majority of the companies, the China is not only accessible as the market because it requires specific license, which is very hard to get. So that's why we cannot even look at the iOS in China as very addressable market. So even in this case, if from iOS we exclude China, then actually we can see that final number in terms of the revenue growth is positive. Yeah, so we see that the last months both on Android and iOS, excluding China, are really positive in terms of revenue growth, which actually is giving good indicator for the 2024. So that's why actually even if we look at the 2024 in terms of revenue growth, it should be better than 2023. Of course, we cannot expect such huge growth as was like in 2021. We see, for example, here, like when that revenue graph starts from like 24% year over year, we cannot expect that, but still we can expect single-digit growth rate, probably between 4 to 8% year over year in the next months. Of course, if we look at overall and we look at whole monetization, the iOS has much higher monetization. We can look even at that data when iOS they're bringing around like 15% of downloads, but they're responsible for around more than 55% of the revenue, which is coming from 2 points. On one side, most of the most important markets on iOS are usually tier 1 markets. So UK, US, those are the most important iOS markets, not only in terms of revenue, but in terms of downloads, versus in Japan, versus in case of Android, of course, we have countries like Indonesia, India. They are bringing really a lot of downloads, so that's why finally small percentage of revenue is responsible for pretty high percentage of downloads. Of course, here we don't have the ads revenue included. It's just in-app purchase and subscription. So that's why if we add the ads, that picture would be a bit different. But overall, we see growing revenue, especially on the like in-app purchases and subscription sites. If we look at what are specific mobile gaming opportunities coming from that, we see that that's overall view of growing categories. If we look at worldwide, in this case, we have worldwide data for Android and worldwide data for iOS, but excluding China, because again, as I mentioned, China is not really addressable market. It includes last 12 months, so include January 2024. And we see a few genres that are growing very heavily. Of course, board iOS, which is a little bit misleading because it's mostly, it's including a lot of revenue, for example, from Monopoly Go, that has huge influence in the whole category, because a lot of games in board category are ads driven, not IAP driven. So that's why this one game plus a few Yahtzee games have quite significant influence on the whole board revenue. We see that in general, casual genres are growing pretty nicely, both on the Android and on iOS side. Like puzzle is going really well. We see that there is a bit more challenges with the core genres like RPG or a strategy. They are more growing on the download side, coming from the fact that they start to be more and more popular in emerging markets. So it's actually quite interesting how the revenue monetization will go, because of course, in this case, those are genres that are almost 100% IIP driven, so purchases and subscriptions. And most likely, once we see more and more of those games being popular in emerging markets, very likely that some ads monetization and hybrid monetization will be coming to those genres as well, to monetize those countries. We see that in general, it's a bit harder challenge around genres like action games, simulation games overall. If we look at smaller genres, because here we had only genres that have at least like 1 billion revenue in the last 12 months. If we look at a little bit smaller genres, I just divided into two screens to make sure that we could look at we could take a look at those smaller genres as well. Again, board, but the same reason as in case of board iOS. We see pretty nice growth for small genres like educational games, trivia games, word games, but again, of course, with much smaller base than in case of the previous screen. If we look at more details around, but which countries are like the most important? It's actually quite interesting to compare like Android and iOS, and we see that, for example, if we look at US, that has pretty similar share of the revenue both on Android and iOS. So it's extremely important, like most important market for both mobile gaming platforms. But at the same time, if we look at the next countries, Of course, Japan is important, especially even more on iOS than Android. Then, of course, we have China, that is extremely important for iOS. In Android, we don't. There is no play in China, but there are some like Chinese Android stores. But the data is not included here. But then, of course, we have other markets that are really important, like South Korea, which is extremely big on Android side, Germany, UK, and again, that number shows what is the share of the specific country in total revenue of the specific platform. But if we go deeper and we ask ourselves, okay, how is actually importance of the specific market? That's actually very interesting data because it's showing the growth of the market during the last 12 months, including January 2024 as well. And we see that if we look at the two axes, like the first one is showing the growth rate in downloads year over year, and then the second one is showing growth of revenue. We see that some markets surprisingly grow quite significantly in both areas. For example, South Korea was a very lucrative market in the last months, especially coming from a few quite big launches, for example, coming from WeMate and a few other big games, mostly coming from RPG space. Then we have markets that in general are getting quite important, especially if we compare it with hybrid monetization like Turkey, that of course has amazing gaming industry, but on the other side is getting quite important market for from the user's perspective as well. We have quite stable but pretty low growth for UK and Germany, but with pretty nice pace, but single digit again around the average of the industry, because as even if we look at the last months, the Android is growing around 5 to 8% year over year, up to 10%. So those UK and Germany are around the average. Then we have the markets that are growing pretty nice in terms of revenue, but the downloads are actually getting more and more challenging there. So even Poland is such markets, is growing pretty nice in terms of revenue, but the user base is not really growing in terms of the downloads. And we see actually the same situation coming to even really big markets like Indonesia, Brazil, where actually that growth of users that was in the last years, especially in the COVID and post-COVID, decreased heavily. And then, of course, we have those markets that are getting very challenging, and they are still very lucrative, but they will be harder and harder. And by the way, the size of the wheel here is the size of the revenue in the market. So of course we see that US, for example, Android is still the biggest market, but is growing below the benchmark for the whole category. Yeah. So if we look at the US overall, the growth on Android is actually below the growth of the category. So most of the growth in the Android is coming from not US but other markets. And then we see actually quite interesting markets like tier 1 markets in Asia, like Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, that actually very often are growing a little bit by downloads, but they're mostly declining because of the revenue. But that's more or less the trend across the whole region there. If we look at smaller markets, because here we had the kind of top markets, then we have the markets that are in the next phase. I just wanted to include bigger number of markets. We see, of course, that in general those smaller markets have much bigger growth than than top one, like top two markets. Of course, here it's different scale. So in this case, like the size of the revenue, for example, in Philippines or like in Indonesia, is much smaller than, for example, in US. So it's just like even if we compare, so this size is the same size as here, yeah, to kind of see the scale. And we see again most of those markets like Kazakhstan, Philippines, Hungary, Romania. There are growth markets, but of course with much smaller base. There are some markets that are very well driven, like United Arab Emirates, for example, or even India, where we see growing monetization. So we see higher and higher monetization gains. So then the revenue is growing, but with declining growth of users. So the even in those markets, the era of extremely cheap users is kind of over. How it looks in terms of iOS. So of course, so in this case we have quite, of course, strong growth of US in terms of revenue, but again, still decline in terms of downloads. So on both on iOS and Android, the focus on monetizations is making that it's harder and harder to actually get new users. We have, of course, China, which is like the bottom left corner, which is like declining very heavily based on the different regulation challenges, based on the different changes in general in the whole ecosystem there. And then we have some markets that in general are growing pretty nicely overall on iOS. Those are especially the Asian markets like Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, South Korea. They are really growing really nicely over the last months on iOS. So especially if you think about iOS, think and look at those markets as well, because again, they can be very lucrative for your next month for 2024 activities. If we go deeper and we look at smaller markets, again we see that the same as in Android, those smallest markets are growing really nicely. So actually, in this case, we see that even Poland, Romania, like Turkey, they are small markets on iOS, but growing very, very nicely. So that's, I think, in general, even on iOS, the marketing will be more and more similar to Android in the way that it's not just only about US, but the other markets will be getting more important as well. Of course, there is a lot of challenges around the privacy thresholds, especially in user acquisition. But I think more and more marketers will be trying to go over it to really benefit from those growing tier 2 and tier 3 markets on iOS. Of course, if we look at those messages as around mobile, like a lot of those messages were quite positive and really good one, but there is some other sides of the story. Like if we look at the overall revenue on mobile gaming, to just make it a little bit easier, I show the data for just US for Android and Google Play. We see very high concentration overall on mobile gaming. Very often that that concentration is even higher on iOS than Android, but even on Android in US, you see that really big part of the revenue on one side is growing, but big part of the revenue is taken just by some top games. So for example, like if we look at the sports category, for example, like top 10 games in the sports category in US on Android are responsible for 60% of in-app and subscription revenue. In some categories, that revenue can be even the revenue concentration can be even bigger. Of course, we can ask ourselves, but that's the IAP part. But how the ads part is growing? It's actually growing pretty nicely. There is not much information, not much data about how this in-app advertising will be expected to grow. But for example, this is quite recent data from Statista. that in general for big categories like games, we expect really strong growth of the ads monetization. So that's why actually even this hybrid monetization is getting so hot topic, because if we see that there are a lot of challenges with IP monetization, even in those very heavy categories like role playing or strategy, there will be more and more players and more developers trying to subsidize that revenue by adding some maybe rewarded videos or some ads to the games. Especially that if we look at the estimated mobile ad spending growth in selected regions, it's of course declining versus the previous years, but it's still very often the whole mobile ad spend is supposed to be growing with the double-digit growth rates in 2024, 2025, 2026. So again, it's really a good topic to look at. Okay, that would be all from my side. I hope it was useful. So mobile still is the fastest growing part of the gaming. We see that in general, the worst in terms of growth is behind us, but still there are a lot of challenges in the industry, especially with the very strong revenue concentration. So entry barrier for the industry is very, very high. So that's why if you are in the industry, you can benefit from that, but entering that industry is extremely challenging, or starting if you started just not long time ago. That would be all from my side. Happy to connect on LinkedIn. That's my code to my LinkedIn profile. Very often I'm kind of sharing there a lot of data around mobile gaming, apps gaming, and gaming and app monetization. So that could be quite interesting for you to look at that from time to time to have the access to the latest data around that market.
Thank you very much, Mariusz. It was a pleasure to hear the insights from you. Please join to the Mariusz LinkedIn. It's like amazing source of new insights which you can get. Thank you again, Mariusz, for your speech. And we gonna go to the next panelist.